After spending the night in a campground near Grand Canyon National Park, where a lightning strike forest fire burned near enough that the air smelled of smoking sage, I was on the road before 7 a.m. No signs of life came from any of the other campsites as I rode toward the park entrance. The night before, a couple of Canadian teenagers asked me if I could give them American change for a Canadian 20, saying that I'd actually make out on the deal since Canadian money was worth more than US currency, a sure sign of the apocalypse. While Canuck money, with its foreign queens, loons, and ice hockey being worth more than American dollars, wasn't necessarily a precursor to zombie hordes, it was a reminder that the economy was still firmly in the shitter and there was no reason to rush home to hunt jobs that didn't exist. At the park gate, I paid the entry fee. Another upside of being on a motorcycle was that park fees were usually cheaper, and started toward the south rim. I'd barely gotten up to speed when three fully grown elk sauntered onto the road ahead of me. Unlike the springy mule deer in the mountains that seemed to bound from one spot to the next, these elk moved at the speed of disinterested teenagers, hardly giving me a second look. Since hunting in national parks was illegal, they had no fear of humans and there was nothing to stop them from growing to their maximum size, and these animals had taken full advantage. Compared to the herds of elk I'd seen in other states, these animals were huge, between 400 and 500 pounds each. Somewhere between the coloring of a deer and a moose, they walked across the road, their muscles visible, flexing and moving beneath their fur. I stopped in the middle of the road and watched until they disappeared into the trees on the opposite side. Not wanting to run into the massive animals, I waited to see if any more would follow out of the brush. When I was sure that no stragglers were waiting to jump out, I stepped on the shifter and continued on. 100 yards further, a buck mule deer, straight out of a Disney movie, stood on the small, flat dirt shoulder. Its brown coat blended in so well with the steep, rock-strewn hill behind it that I would have ridden past without noticing if it hadn't twisted its neck to tear a leaf from a bush at the last second. The motion caught my attention and I turned my head just in time to see Bambi's dad 3 feet away. Instinctively, I dropped my weight hard to the left, swerving into the oncoming lane without a thought of SUVs or pickup trucks. Thankfully, the lane was clear and I jerked back into my own lane. I assumed the sound of my bike would spook him and he'd jump into the brush, but as I watched in my rearview mirror, he didn't even stop eating. Pulling to the side of the road, I twisted in my seat to look back. A massive rack, still covered in velvet and so thick it looked too heavy for the buck's neck, sprouted from its head. Its light brown coat, thick and rough, covered its well-fed body. There was no indent behind the ribs like you often saw on mountain deer that have to scrounge for their dinners. He fed from the green, hardy bushes that looked to have weathered 1,000 dry summers rooted in the rocky incline. The same kind of plants burned a few miles away, filling the air with the taste of smoke. I made a U-turn and pulled to a stop directly across from the buck. It continued pulling green leaves off the bush without so much as a glance in my direction. I felt odd straddling my motorcycle just a few feet away from an animal whose cousins had tried to kill me more times than I cared to think about. Taking out my camera, I turned it on expecting the powering up chime to scare the deer off, but a high school band could have stomped by playing When the Saints Come Marching In, and it wouldn't have stopped chewing. I snapped a few pictures and then sat back and watched as it ate breakfast, stripping leaf after leaf from the rough-looking bush, only stopping long enough to chew and swallow before going for the next bite. Traffic began to pick up and I expected at any moment for the buck to see me or the oncoming cars and bolt up the hill, but it never happened. SUVs and sedans towing campers blew past within a couple of feet, pushing air hard enough to shake the branches, but nothing that wasn't made of foliage seemed any interest to them. Eventually, I pulled myself away from the deer, blew another U-turn, and driving past close enough that I could have patted it, headed for the canyon. The south rim of the Grand Canyon had been built up as a tourist destination, with massive slabs of pavement for parking, welcome centers, paved walking and bike paths that ran along the canyon's edge, bus tours, gift shops, a restaurant, and scenic overlook pull-offs. Near the parking lots, black, waist-high steel railings protected the edge of the canyon. Further away from the parking, the railings disappeared, leaving people's survival in the hands of their own common sense, which, according to the overabundance of people in the scarcity of common sense, was probably asking a lot. When I pulled into the first parking lot I came to, it was still early enough that almost all the spaces were empty. My plan was to spend a few minutes, an hour tops, taking pictures at the canyon and then head for Utah. I didn't plan to spend much time because, frankly, I didn't expect much from it. If seeing pictures of the Hoover Dam had drained away some of its power, then I couldn't imagine the Grand Canyon having any left. After all, the giant hole in the ground showed up in movies, television, and just about every nature show ever filmed. I couldn't walk into a classroom, cubicle, or dentist's office without running into a poster of the canyon, usually accompanied by some random inspirational blurb like, "Determination. Like the Colorado River carving out the Grand Canyon, it's unstoppable." Or, "Persistence. It's a force of nature." Or, "Flossing. It's important." But I was wrong. Actually, I'd never been so utterly and completely wrong as to think that some cliched shots of the Grand Canyon could drain away even a fraction of the power that came from standing at its rim. For me, seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time was a lot like sex in that they were equally indescribable to someone who hadn't experienced them. There were a few things in life where any attempt at translating the moment to another person fell flat. These were times when, if a person hadn't experienced them for himself, then no amount of words could express what those moments contained. Far better writers than I had tried to distill something as complex as sex into a handful of symbols on a page and failed miserably. The natural impulse was to begin with bare facts and statistics, but then, before you knew it, you were saying things like friction and mucous membrane, and you ended up further away from the truth than when you started. The same was true for visiting the Grand Canyon. I could explain that Grand Canyon National Park was 1,217,403.32 acres in the northwest corner of Arizona, averaged 10 miles wide and a mile deep. It'd become a national park in 1919 and saw more than 5 million visitors a year. I could say that the South Rim was 7,000 feet in elevation and 10 miles away the North Rim was 8,000 feet, or that the park was on the Colorado Plateau and the Colorado River had been cutting its way into it for 6 million years, unless you're a creationist, in which case it started sometime last Tuesday. While all true, those facts didn't do justice to the 5 seconds of standing on the edge of its cliff and staring at an unobstructed view of millions of years of erosion stretching out of sight. My first view of the canyon came near where I parked. I walked north, past the standard fare I'd come to expect at modern tourist attractions. Water bottle filling stations, informational signs about historic and cultural significance, and those green plastic dog poop bag dispensers. Leaving all that behind, I followed a footpath pushing through a thin stand of trees and came to the edge of a mile-deep gouge in the earth so perfect that it looked fake. I half expected to see the curtain shift in the breeze and the whole landscape ripple like an old John Wayne movie. The sun, still low in the east, cast long shadows inside the canyon, leaving half the world below dark while the other half glowed in direct light. Much of the rock was pale-colored, reflecting the sun, and I was thankful for my sunglasses as I easily could have suffered a kind of snow blindness in mid-August desert. Against the stark whites and grays, the green of trees and shrubs growing on the canyon walls looked like the mouths of caves. Most of the canyon looked harsh and unlivable, but still the trees somehow took root, some in such strange places that their existence seemed impossible. Trees grew from the unforgiving stone, having been once seeds planted in tiny cracks by the wind. They sprouted on otherwise bare-rocked ledges and stone pinnacles. It was a good thing that my camera was digital because I would have gone through a case of film at the first viewing point. I took pictures of the cliffs, the horizon, the river far below. I snapped landscape pictures in a failed attempt at capturing the scope of the canyon and close-ups of single formations. One rock in particular, roughly the size of a Volkswagen bus, perilously perched on a thin column, had my undivided attention for a good 20 minutes. But none of the pictures I took did any justice to the canyon, much like I'm sure my handful of words won't either. I could have spent the entire day at the first little outcropping I came to, but I reminded myself that this place was huge and if I wanted to see even a fraction of it, then I needed to get moving. Tearing myself away from the initial spot, I followed the paved walking trails west. The trails traced the edge of the canyon, occasionally breaking away when it wasn't feasible to continue so closely, and I plodded along as swiftly as 7,000 feet in elevation and a 50-pound pack would allow. Read slowly and with many breaks. As I hiked, I naturally fell into my old habit from my days as a surveyor's helper of staring at my feet instead of looking where I was going. I hiked along with my head down, not paying attention to anything but the sound of my boots scraping the asphalt, when I almost plowed into a woman standing completely still in the middle of the path. She stood in the middle of the walkway because an adult female elk, at least as big as the 3 I'd spooked on the way into the park, stood grazing 100 feet away. The park had erected metal fencing around certain native plants in an attempt to protect them from tourist feet and foraging animals. It was one of the many ways the park rangers tried to ensure the local flora survived. The elk didn't seem to care. She tucked her snout under the bottom edge of the fencing and flicked her neck, tossing the metal cage out of her way like a model flipping her hair out of her eyes. With her stomach stretched as if she was pregnant, it was too late in the season for that to be the case, her thin legs didn't look big enough to hold up her weight. Elk were normally herd animals, and the fact that she was foraging alone may have meant that she had a calf hidden somewhere. And as anyone who's ever bumped into a mother's shopping cart in Walmart can attest, animals with young can be dangerous. Pulling out my camera, I snapped a couple of pictures, stepped closer, snapped a few more, stepped closer, a few more, closer. Without even thinking about it, I was breaking one of the cardinal rules of national parks, and, more importantly, common sense. Reminders to stay at least 100 feet away from large animals were scattered all throughout the park on signs, flyers, and the little newsletter they gave you at the gate. I was so focused on the little digital screen in my hand that I was within 15 feet of a 500-pound wild animal before I knew it. I was close enough that I could make out the vein as big around as my middle finger running up her hind leg. Standing behind a 4-inch tree, I was about to step closer when the elk lifted its head, stared at me, its eyes glued on mine, and flared its nostrils. My leg froze mid-stride, and the saliva in my mouth evaporated so quickly that I was surprised it didn't make a hissing sound as my mouth turned into a desert. While I wasn't fluent in elk, I was pretty sure that she just told me she was about to open a can of whoop-ass if I took one more step. It's a little-known fact that elk communicate almost entirely in WWE speak. After its warning glare, the elk returned to its grazing, but its message was clear. You didn't have to be doing 60 miles an hour on a motorcycle for an elk to put you in a world of hurt. Some people might wonder why I'd be afraid of a half-tame herbivore. While park animals had grown used to people to the point that they appeared tame, they were still very much wild and could react violently when approached by a predator, or some idiot who just wanted a better picture. YouTube was filled with proof the sort of thing happened all the time. No one in the Grand Canyon had been killed by a stampeding elk yet, but there were plenty of broken arms, legs, concussions, and at least one goring. As slow and clumsy as I was, with or without my heavy pack weighing me down, it wouldn't have taken much for her to stomp me into the ground. The strangest part about almost getting trampled by a vegetarian was that I knew better. I'd grown up in moose country, listening to stories of angry moose mauling hikers and charging freight trains head-on. I'd laughed at people who made the news after trying to pet a buffalo in Yellowstone, befriend a black bear in the Smoky Mountains, or hand-feed a grizzly in Denali. I'd always considered stories like these to be proof of natural selection, but here I was walking toward this wild animal like it was the family wiener dog. It made me wonder how I'd lived to see 28 years old. In the last few days alone, I'd gotten into a stranger's potential kidnapper mobile, almost caused a terrorist scare at the Hoover Dam, and just frolicked my way into the stomping range of an animal known for headbutting cars. The red-headed waitress was right. For someone with a lot of standardized tests that claimed I was smart, I had a lot of first-hand experience proving I was a dumbass. I was still trying to figure out how I'd managed to Forrest Gump my way through almost 3 decades of survival when I came across a young couple walking in the opposite direction 20 yards down the rim trail. They were both short, thin, with deep tans and dark hair. They moved slowly, their eyes glued on the view of the canyon. I felt obligated to tell them about the elk so that they too could have a chance to see it before it wandered away. Never being much for sparking up conversations with strangers, I had to fight against my nature to just walk past. Making it more difficult than usual was the fact that, while on a good day I was 6 feet tall and 200 pounds with the social skills of a crotchety hermit, on this trip I was 6 feet tall and close to 190 pounds with the social skills of a crotchety hermit and the grooming habits of a sterno-huffing hobo. Forcing myself to act like a normal human being, I waved and smiled. If you walk about 20 yards that way, I said, pointing back in the direction I'd come, you'll see a big female elk grazing. As soon as I opened my mouth, the woman grabbed the man's arm, clutching him close. The man's eyebrows scrunched down tightly and his mouth puckered into a little white ball. Instantly, I regretted not minding my own business. Why does he look so scared? I'd say he looks more angry than scared. Either way, that's a weird reaction to being told about an elk. That's the face someone makes right before they shoot you. I don't think they allow guns in the Grand Canyon. Fine, stabbed, or maced. Either way, if he reaches for his pocket, run. The man rubbed his chin, pressing his hand into his mouth. The woman, never letting go of his arm, subtly stepped behind him, her eyes wide. Why does he look so mad? Because at this point, you look like a serial killer. I just wanted to share the elk grazing. He probably thinks you're trying the old "there's an elk grazing over here" ploy. I don't think that's a thing. You should run away now. Quick, before he gets his knife. He doesn't have a knife. Why would he have a knife? You have a knife. The man frowned and finally spoke. Speak slowly, please, he said in a heavy Italian accent that I'm not going to pretend to do. They broke into identical, apologetic smiles, the kind reserved for people visiting foreign lands without a firm grasp of the native language. Ha! I let out a stress-relieving laugh, realizing I wasn't about to get shivved. Even though I knew nothing about them, I immediately liked them. It took a certain amount of bravery to visit a country that spoke something other than your native tongue. You had to have faith in your limited vocabulary skills and that complete strangers wouldn't take advantage of the language gap. I didn't have that courage. Hell, I didn't even like going south of Connecticut. Oh, okay, I said. There is an elk grazing over there. I pointed back toward where I'd left the big animal. What is elk? The man asked, still forcing his smile. An elk is... And I stopped. How could I describe an elk to someone who only spoke broken English? In my head, I could hear the vaguely British voice of a National Geographic narrator saying, an elk is a quadruped ungulate of a cervidae family, native to large stretches of North America, but that wasn't going to help. What I needed was something short, simple, and universally recognizable, but the only words that came to my mind were herbivore and quadruped. Silently, I cursed all educational channels. Scrambling for something to say, I finally settled on, like a big deer. Blank stares met that bit of genius description. They'd been smiling for so long that their grins were becoming unsettling and looked vaguely painful. With words failing, thanks again, multiple English degrees, the only thing left to do was mime an elk grazing, which, it turned out, was much more difficult than one would think. My first thought was the old standby, thumbs on either side of my head with 8 fingers splayed in bullwinkle horns. But Bullwinkle was a male moose, and my elk was a lady, and lady elk didn't have antlers. For some reason, I thought that would be unfair to the Italian couple who would expect a massive racked mammal when all I had to offer was a massive bare-headed ungulate. With the simplest pantomime not an option, I began tracing the rough shape of an elk in the air. Granted, it could also have been the rough shape of a bear, dog, or the state of Oklahoma, while pointing at a clump of grass and repeating the word elk. Clearly, this was more a postmodern interpretation of elk than the situation called for. After I air traced an imaginary animal for what felt like 20 minutes, was probably closer to 20 seconds, the Italian man suddenly got really excited and said, thank you, multiple times, grabbed the woman by the hand, and quick-stepped in the direction I pointed. It happened so fast that it took me by surprise, especially since, unless he was psychic, there was no way he could have understood what I'd been trying to tell them with my pointing and Picasso-like air drawings. I imagine that as they hurried away, they had a conversation that went something like this. Woman, what the hell was he trying to tell us? Man, I have no idea. Woman, if you don't know, then why did you get all excited and start dragging me this way? Man, because it was the best way I could think of to get away from that crazy hobo mime. Woman, good thinking. Hey look, an elk grazing. Just as I turned back from watching the couple speed walk away from me, it hit me. I could have skipped the entire pantomime act and just shown them pictures on my camera. Dumbass, I said, shaking my head and continuing on my hike. By 9 o'clock, the walking trails that I'd mostly had to myself earlier were suddenly filled with other tourists. Dads carrying toddlers in backpacks, entire families on summer vacations, the elderly with cameras the size of 80s rappers' clocks swinging from their necks, and foreign tourists clogged up the paths. My back ached, feet dragged, and my shirt would have been soaked through with sweat if it weren't for the blazing sun immediately evaporating any liquid that leaked out of me. A massive crow followed me, hopping from rock to rock, flapping its dark wings and blinking its black doll eyes. There was something about walking along the edge of a mile-deep canyon with a death bird trailing me that brought out my superstitious side. The evolved, logical part of my brain understood that it'd learned to shadow tourists from years of them tossing it bits of food, like pigeons begging breadcrumbs in Central Park, and respected its right to live in peace. The reptilian part of my brain wanted to throw rocks at it. As unafraid as any of the other animals, the crow came within a couple of feet of me and stared with its cold carrion-eater eyes. It hopped on its scaly black feet, jumping from boulder to boulder, waiting for me to either toss it food or fall to my death. No matter how many times I told myself that this soul chicken was just a harmless bird, I couldn't get past being a little uneasy each time it hopped up to me on its little black dinosaur feet, cocking its head as if to get a better view of its dinner. To get past my reptile brain, I started talking to the crow as if I were the world's worst tour guide. Most people believe that the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River over 6 million years, but in reality it was dug by Irish laborers over a long weekend after they'd finished building the Transcontinental Railroad and had nothing better to do. The crow blinked at the sound of my voice. I pointed to a spot deep in the canyon. Fun fact, President Garfield used the Grand Canyon as the launching point for America's failed war against the mole men. Holding a one-sided conversation with a crow didn't go over well with the other tourists. A family of 4 stepped wide off the walkway, climbing over rocks rather than coming close to me. Even the people speaking foreign languages gave me plenty of space. At first, I thought that was weird, since they couldn't understand my words. I assumed they wouldn't know how crazy it sounded. Then I realized that filthy bearded guy talking to himself translated into crazy in any language. Not that that stopped me. All hail our mole men overlords. The crow fluttered its wings before resettling them on its back. It was a tough crowd. Needing a break, I sprawled out on the nearest bench like a drunk frat brother on a futon. Filthy, scruffy, and laughing at my own stupid jokes, a married couple gave me a funny look and not so subtly pulled their young son away, giving me the added bonus of not having to share a bench. The crow hopped closer than ever, maybe thinking that I was about to pull out a sandwich or pass out from exhaustion. Clearly disappointed when neither happened, it gave up on me and hopped along after a sweating, red-faced, obese family. It must have figured it had better odds with them. A small Albert squirrel off to my left sat on its haunches, tearing the meat out of a series of seeds. Unlike the large gray squirrels back home, this one was smaller, very dark gray colored, with long tufts on its ears and a dark chestnut stripe down its back. Also, unlike the gray squirrels at my house, this Albert squirrel didn't care that I sat 4 feet away or that a steady stream of people walked by. All the large animals, or megafauna if you owned a thesaurus, had disappeared at the same time that the park began filling up with people. No elk or mule deer wandered around the trails, leaving only squirrels, jays, and the aforementioned crows. With no elk or deer to draw the attention of the tourists, and everyone in agreement that crows were creepy, the people zoned in on the one animal left, the lowly squirrel. For the amount of attention that squirrel near my bench received, you would have thought it was a rock star. Almost every person that walked by stopped and snapped a picture or two. Spending about the same amount of time a sane person might stop and goo-goo at a baby in a stroller. Group after group stopped to take pictures without anything noteworthy happening, unless you counted an odd rodent fixation as noteworthy. When a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavian family of 4, father, mother, daughter, son, came by and stood out from all the others. They stood out for 2 reasons. 1, instead of taking a couple of pictures and moving on, they seemed intent on befriending the squirrel. And 2, the daughter wore a pair of shorts so tiny they'd make a porn star blush. They were made out of less material than my belt, and she topped them off with a tank top made out of a rare, transparent strain of cotton. The rest of the family was dressed in the typical tourist uniform, jeans, a t-shirt, and sturdy hiking shoes, making it look like they were a normal, stereotypical family that had accidentally adopted a stripper. While I had no way of knowing her exact age, she could have been anywhere between 16 and 20. I guessed she was on the younger side of that scale because my first thought when seeing her was, please God, don't let me have daughters. What struck me most about her walking around in what some of my ex-girlfriends would have considered lingerie was that her mother and father didn't mind. In fact, they seemed to be encouraging it by having her pose for pictures. I like to think that one of those pictures became the family's Christmas card, and now there's a photo of a girl dressed like a stripper cavorting with a rodent stuck to the refrigerator at some Scandinavian old folks' home. The mother was the first to spot the squirrel. She stopped to take a picture of it, then turned to her kids and said something in one of the dozens of languages I heard that day that I didn't understand. While I had no way of knowing exactly what she said, I knew what to expect. Rolled eyes and deep sighs. Snotty teenager transcended all language barriers after all. But, to my surprise, both of the kids eagerly scrambled up behind the little rodent, creeping up close enough so the mother could get them all in a single frame. The squirrel, for its part, stopped eating long enough to look back at them. This got excited laughter, and, deciding they weren't a threat, returned to its seed. With their pictures taken, I expected the family to move along like all the others had, but instead the father took the camera from the mother and, in their rough-sounding tongue, cajoled her into posing with the squirrel. Instead of stepping behind the animal like her children had, she stepped directly next to it, her body rigid as if a lion sat next to her instead of a 1-pound rodent. Apparently not content with a picture of the squirrel sitting near the mother, the father pulled out a granola bar from his bag, breaking off a small piece that he handed to his wife. With words and hand gestures, he encouraged her to feed it out of her hand. Part of me wondered if I should try to warn them against that. The squirrels were such an attraction with people trying to pet and hand feed them that Grand Canyon rangers had taken to telling visitors that squirrels were the most dangerous animal in the park. That sounded like bullshit when you considered the park was home to rattlesnakes and mountain lions, and a cute little 1-pound rock squirrel's bite couldn't be that serious. But that cute little puff of dark fur was known to carry hantaviruses, rabies, and the plague, as in the bubonic plague. The same disease that killed so many people in the Middle Ages that over 500 years after it finally burnt itself out, kindergarten classes still sang nursery rhymes inspired by it. In the end, I decided against warning them because I didn't want to ruin their fun, and after my elk grazing debacle, I had no desire to attempt to mime bubonic plague. It was odd watching a family so enthralled by a common squirrel that they completely ignored the Grand Canyon. They laughed and clapped every time the little rodent twitched its nose or flicked its tail. Meanwhile, 15 feet behind them was one of the greatest wonders in all of nature, something that people came from all over the world to see. Maybe they'd been there long enough that the spectacle had worn off and their camera was already filled with pictures of the landscape. I couldn't know, but I had to fight the urge to tap the father on the shoulder and point out that behind them was something that had to be more interesting than a little blunt-faced rat. And I would have done just that if my liberal arts education hadn't kicked in. I thought about it and realized that to these people, seeing a rock squirrel might have been as exotic and exciting as the elk had been to me. Why should the size of the mammal have anything to do with the amount of excitement derived from interacting with it? I rationalized that really it was all relative and about context. My 7 years in college, and yet still not a doctor, had taught me that I needed to step outside my ethnocentric worldview and appreciate these foreign visitors' experiences. Their experience was equally valid to any I was having, and I should treasure it for what it was. And that lasted for all about 12 seconds before I shook all that crap out of my head and returned to the opinion that it was a bushy-tailed rat that may or may not be affected with the Black Death. As I headed back toward my bike, it struck me that between the crows, deer, and elk, I'd had more interactions with the local animals than with any of the hundreds of tourists that flowed by. Other than the Italian couple, I hadn't spoken to a single person. Maybe it was because I'd spent so much time alone lately that it had just become easier to ignore people. Or maybe people ignored me because I was covered in a couple thousand miles of road grime and had taken up talking to carrion feeders. I would have understood if no one wanted to talk to the crow whisperer, but that didn't explain why none of the people passing by so much as made eye contact with one another. The park was filled with every flavor of tourist. Foreigners, families, the elderly, and backpacking 20-somethings trudged past one another with all the enthusiasm of teenagers passing each other in the hall on their way to algebra class. Every one of them had traveled hundreds, if not thousands of miles to see this giant hole in the earth, but none of them made any attempt to connect with anyone else over the fact that they were experiencing one of the world's natural wonders. Instead, they avoided eye contact with the commitment of men at the urinal trough at a Steelers game. I chalked it up to the fact that humans were just weird, and went back to giving the crow a guided tour.